This Dragon of the Apocalypse strikes against his foes over and over and over again, and it uses the rage of all creatures to empower its flames to vanquish any who dares to stand against him. This is Overlord, the End. Stand up! Vanguard! Hey Cardfighters, welcome to a new spotlight, and this time we're gonna talk about the new Dragonic Overlord, the End, and all the fun cards that we can use to empower this new strategy for Kagero, or basically Overlord the Clan. We already seen a strategy that revolves around the Great, which uses some rearguard potential to increase the output against your opponent. However, with the End, it's all about the End. This deck and this card focus completely on itself and uses any kind of tool to empower itself to immeasurable heights and then overwhelm your opponent with an unending onslaught of attacks that comes from your Vanguard. And if that sounds anything remotely interesting to you, then you come to the right place, as we're jumping right into this spotlight to discuss the new Dragonic Overlord, the End. For this spotlight, we built a list that comprises of 8 grade 3s, 11 grade 2s, 40 grade 1s, and 17 grade 0s. We run 4 copies of the new Dragonic Overlord, the End. This is basically the main unit which the entire deck is gonna revolve around, and you're gonna see in a moment how we're gonna do that. For the support card, we run 4 copies of Dragonic Overlord. It's basically a setup card for the End, as well as a potential backup for the early game when we have no way to go into the End. Then for grade 2s, we run 4 copies of the new support card, Wyvern Strike the Cut. This allows us to give our the End the Battledore effect, and with a multiple resetting Vanguard, that can amount to incredible annoying guard restriction against your opponent. We also run 4 copies of Spillover Dragon. We mainly use this card to have some extra way to fill out the soul, as soul is probably going to be an issue for this deck, but also to have some mid-battle retire options to have some interesting plays, as we're going to talk about in just a moment. To round up the grade 2 lineup, we also put in 3 copies of Dragonic Burnout. This is just another card that allows us to have a main phase retire option, but also maybe recycling some key units like Dragonic Overlord, the End, but it's mainly because of its main phase rearguard retire potential that can synergize with other cards. Then for the grade 1 slots, we run 4 copies of Sable Dragon Newt. This is basically a cycle card and a good draw engine for the early game, as well as mid to late game when we're missing the right key pieces. Then in the same breath, we also run 4 copies of Flame of Hope Airmail. This is basically another version of Sable Dragon Newt, only this time we have an added bonus that it can countercharge, and that's going to come in handy as we're using a lot of counterblast in this deck. Then we also run 3 copies of Calamity Tower Wyvern. This is basically essentially the reason how we can power up the End even better, especially when we are going to focus on Force 2 in certain matchups. And to round up the grade 1 slots, we also run 3 copies of Red Dive Griffin. This card not only gives us some guard break potential, but it also synergizes really good with the Cut, as the guard restriction of the Cut still will be active after we use Griffin's skill, but more on that later in the video. For the grade 0s, we of course run the obvious starter, and for triggers, we run 4 heals, 8 crits, and 4 draw RPGs. The main strategy of this deck is to empower your Dragonic Overlord, the End, to immeasurable heights and then beat over your opponent with an unstoppable multi-attacking Vanguard. The way to realize this is combining every potential card to strengthen your Vanguard. The perfect situation is to have a Overlord in the soul, so you can restand the End 2 times, then give him the Battledore effect with Wyvern Strike the Cut, and use 1 or 2 Calamity Tower Wyverns to empower your Vanguard with some insane powers, and then have a Red Drive Griffin behind your Vanguard to add the extra pressure in the form of a guard break potential. And that without the inclusion of either Force 1 or Force 2. But the deck is a little bit more complex than just that play. Each card serves a role in the deck to either empower your the End turn or to help achieve the correct scenario. Dragonic Overlord, the End is a great Vanguard because he can work on his own. It's not bad to ride him as a first Vanguard because he doesn't need any setup. The only downside is that you need to have a low hand size to use its skill. You can enable this through multiple ways. You can either call a full field and be very aggressive from the start. Most cards in this deck also helps by removing themselves from the field to get an extra benefit out of them. Another good way is to guard early on so you sit on a low damage. The upside of this deck is, even though it has many units that uses counterblast, it doesn't need much it can work with 1 or 2 counterblasts each turn. The original Dragonic Overlord's restand skill also works ideally with the end, as yes, you are minusing on hand, but at the same time you're getting some more aggro, which can help setting the ideal scenario for the end. Choosing the type of force markers is also very important for this deck, as both types are useful for different scenarios. Against most protect decks you might want to take Force 2, as it also synergizes with the cut, and the end can get more power with its own skill and Tower Wyvern. But Force 1 is better against non-protect decks, or in the case you aren't getting your Decat, or they are already at a high damage when they go into a grade 3. Normally putting your opponent at a high damage before going into a grade 3 is very hard for Kagero, but not necessarily for this build, as all cards in this list have an on attack or act skill, which means you can just slam units on the board in the early game to push your opponent, while at the same time not losing out on place effects. Also, most cards in this list are quite expendable, so it's not that bad to lose 1 or 2 of these cards. Now that you have a general idea on how the deck functions, let me show you some tactics you can deploy to completely take advantage out of each and every card in this deck. The cut, like Tower Wyvern, are very simple in the use with the end. They can remove themselves from the field during the main phase, which can help you minusing on hand enough to get the restand for the end. But at the same time, we have Airmo and Dragonute in the deck to help with more consistency and help search for cards like Griffin, Tower Wyvern and the cut. For the same reason, we have Burnout, as he can retire during the main phase, which allows you potentially chain into cards like Tower Wyvern and the cut. But there's another way to use these cards. The big problem of the end is that you end up with a hand size of 5 after his restand. However, there is a trick to end up with more cards in your hand so you have a better defense. That's thanks to Spillover Dragon, as he allows you to have a mid-battle retire option. So what you do is attack with your Vanguard first and then attack with Spillover and then use his skill, and by doing so you can use your Airmo and Dragonute skill to draw more cards to maybe end up with 7 or 8 cards in hand. Another nice card combo is Wyvern Strike the Cut and Red Drive Griffin. Thanks to the Cut's skill, your opponent is forced to call 2 cards at the same time to guard. This is perfect with Griffin, as you can then retire one of their guardians to make the guard not sufficient enough anymore, meaning they need to call another 2 new cards from their hand to the guardian circle to guard the attack. Your opponent can counter this by placing 3 guardians in one go to prevent this, but then you can just decide not to use Griffin and just make them overguard even more than normal. You can use this card as a part of a mid-game tactic in combination with the cut, but be careful, the card is countered with just a perfect guard, because he can't remove the nullify effect. So the best moment for this card is to use it on the second attack or on the first attack if they are forced to guard that attack as well. But of course, this depends completely on what's the current scenario. But to use all these tactics, you need to get a tight grip on your resources game, as resources are very tight in this deck, especially your soul. We got 5 cards that uses Counterblast and only 1 card that generates it. Luckily, even though the number is high, you probably are only using 2 Counterblasts a turn for your grade 3 turns and onwards, which means you should have plenty. The main Counterblast you're going to use is for the end himself. Then after that, you're using the other ones for the grade 2s for their scenarios. The cut to create more powerful push turns, Spillover to create a draw turn or generate more soul, and Burnout is here for the extra pressure or as a cycle starter to search for key pieces. Counterblast is mostly used to allow for different plays, but Soul is mainly used to empower the end, as Tower Wyvern, Griffin and the end himself uses Soul, and Soul is even more limited because we need to keep a grade 3 in our Soul to activate the end's second effect. So to compensate that, we have cards like the Cut and Spillover to fill the Soul with more cards, so we can use cards like Tower Wyvern and Griffin. Just like Counterblast, the main use of our soul goes towards the end himself, but in the right scenario, you can use the other 2 cards to push for damage. Also, don't forget you can use Griffin just as a bluff in some scenarios. Now that everything has been explained, let me go over the alternative way to build a deck, as this is focused on the end himself, but you can also make it a more general Overlord deck. To do this, you can run the grade besides the OG Overlord and the end. This can be in a 4-2-2 split, or a 4-3-2, or in a 4-4-2, and depending on your personal taste, which Overlord is run at what number can change completely. Also for the grade 2 lineup, you can change either Spillover or Burnout to a Neoflame, and you can also play Neoflame and the Cut at 3 together. but you can also replace the card for Neoflame and change one of the other grade 2s into a Berserk Dragon. For grade 1s, you can keep these units as they function with all 3 Overlords, but depending on your soul economy, you might want to replace Griffin as he's the least versatile of the 4 with something like Dragonmon Gojo, as seen as he's synergized really good with the grade and Neoflame. But you can also remove the card completely. This also gives you the room to run a higher grade 3 count. In terms of triggers, you're free to do what you please, but keep in mind, draw triggers can screw you over during the end turn because they can make you go over the hand size limit for its skill. This new Kagero deck is something that makes the name Overlord really true to its legacy. It's all about a gigantic dragon that destroys everything in its path with its flames. But even though that sounds very one-dimensional, this deck is much more than that, as when it's in capable hands, this deck can really bring forth the apocalypse. And with that, we conclude this spotlight for Dragonic Overlord, The End. Overall, a very interesting approach to The End, which is all focused around a single unit that's gonna restand and then focus on destroying your opponent, and all these cards that empower this specific unit to make it all the more devastating. As stated in the video, this is not the most completely meta optimized deck, as you probably also want to incorporate the other Overlord cards and make a more diverse package with more diverse routes. In this spotlight, we mainly focus on The End himself and bring out its max potential to light. So what do you think of the new Dragonic Overlord The End? Are you really excited about this new design, which really is focusing on multi-attacking with your Vanguard against your opponent and all these cards that empower this specific dragon that can really bring forth the pain? Or are you just a generic fan of Dragonic Overlord himself and any kind of Overlord is a big plus for you? Or are you just a Kagero player and you're just happy the fact that we've got another very strong Vanguard skill as well as all these generic new cards that can empower all kinds of strategies? Let me know in the comments down below what you think of this new Overlord The End as well as the capabilities of this card, as it is endless. As always, I want to thank my supporters over at Patreon for making this video possible. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel, then head over to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Timeleaf, and I'll see you guys in the next one.